It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated, once again dedicated, here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they have given the last full measure of devotion, that we highly resolve that they shall not have died in vain. Died in vain is a phrase that George Washington had used when he went to visit some of the soldiers who had served under him and at a burial place for them. That this nation, again, repeats nation, shall have a new birth, again, new birth, birth, death, new birth of freedom, that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Now, there's a debate about whether Lincoln really said that government of the people or this government. And there's different views on whether it's more significant if he said government or this government. But the more important point is people ask, where did he get that phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth? Well, there are some people who suggest that it was taken from another thing that he had read when he was a younger man. There are other people who have used that phrasing before. Lincoln had not used it before. But the main point that is conveyed by the entire speech is that the country came together to try something new, making all men created equal, and we shouldn't let this experiment die, and we should try to work toward, in the future, to make sure this kind of experiment lives on. Gary Wills has written a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the Gettysburg Address, and in there he says the most important part of this speech is really when Lincoln says 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, because what he's saying is that Lincoln really had a sleight of hand here. Most of the soldiers were fighting to preserve the Union. That was what the Civil War was about. It was to preserve the Union. And Lincoln is in effect saying the purpose of the war is to make sure we have a country where all men are created equal. A sleight of hand according to Wills. And really the point is that what Lincoln was trying to say is that we just don't want to have the Union be held together if all men are not going to be created equal. That's more important. He doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation in this particular speech because it was, in fact, already known. He'd issued it in January 1 of 1863. This is now November. And so what he's trying to do is not talk about slavery per se, because he realizes that raising the word slavery or the Emancipation Proclamation might not be that popular, but by saying it, we're trying to do what Jefferson wanted to do. He's in effect trying to make what his words are more popular and more politically appealing to those who he's talking to. So this speech was not, as I say, that popular at the time that it was given. It didn't get people jumping up and down and saying thank you very much. He was interrupted by applause, I think 3 times, and at the end he was given appropriate applause. And the Gettysburg Address was not all that significant a document and speech for many, many years. It really, Lincoln always said the most important thing that he had done was the Emancipation Proclamation. That was what he intended to be remembered for. It wasn't his speech. And in fact, when his 2 assistants, John Hay and John Nicolay, he had 2 assistants, when they wrote a 10-volume book on Lincoln, they barely mentioned the Gettysburg Address. It was only later in the 20th century that it became an important thing. It became important because a book had been written about the Gettysburg Address that was popular, and it kind of said that Lincoln had written it on an envelope going up on a train, which wasn't quite true. But this book was well read, and it popularized the Gettysburg Address. But as we were going into World War I, we wanted kind of a reason to save the world for democracy. Remember, Wilson had said we're going to make the world safe for democracy. Well, the best way to kind of talk about what we're trying to do to make the world safe for democracy was a set of principles that Lincoln had talked about. And so the Gettysburg Address was kind of taken as a way to talk about what America was all about. And then when it was decided in the early part of the 20th century, really 1920s or so, to have a memorial to Lincoln in Washington, D.C., the person who was the sculptor decided to put on the back of Lincoln, behind Lincoln, the words of the Gettysburg Address. He didn't put the words of the Emancipation Proclamation because they're not that eloquent. And so when that Lincoln Memorial was opened, I think in 1922, the words that were up there were mostly the words from the Gettysburg Address. And increasingly, people began to take on the view that the Gettysburg Address was an embodiment of what America was all about. And so it was more than 50 years after the speech was given before it became such a popular speech. Now, of course, it's iconic, but at the time it really wasn't.